History and Culture podcasts are a production of PCN, a nonprofit television network. Listeners like you make our programming possible. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Welcome to PCN's History and Culture podcast. I'm Phil Beckman. This podcast series features interviews exploring Pennsylvania's rich history from the colonial era to industrialization, the Gettysburg campaign to sports history, and from art to politics and more. Ronald Kirkwood is the author of Tell Mother Not to Worry, Soldier Stories from Gettysburg's George Spangler Farm. Ron, take us back to 1863 at the Spangler Farm. Just before the battle started, what would we have seen?
The Spanglers bought 80 acres there in 1848, and by 1863, they had grown it to 166 acres. This was a profitable farm. You would have seen all the typical livestock, and the chickens and the hogs. George and Elizabeth were 47 and 44 during the Battle of Gettysburg, and they had 4 children living at home, all living at home, ages 14, 17, 19, and 21. You would have seen an idyllic place, a prosperous place where they take their vegetables and their fruits into town. Gettysburg was a trades town. They needed agriculture that the Spanglers provided. You would have seen a beautiful, beautiful red Pennsylvania bank barn, a nice house, but a small one, a summer kitchen, various other outbuildings. And with it grown to 166 acres, it was private. So this was a nice, quiet, peaceful, thriving farm in 1863.
Where was it in relation to the town itself?
So it's just south of Gettysburg. For anybody who's watching who knows where the visitor center is, it's just south of there, a half mile down. It's just off the Baltimore Pike. If anybody knows where the Granite Schoolhouse Lane is, that cuts right through the middle of the 1863 George Spangler Farm, connecting the Baltimore Pike and the Taneytown Road. And that location, in the battle, it was right behind the line. It was close to the left flank of the line and Little Round Top. It was close to the center of the line, and it was close to the right flank of the line at Culp's Hill. So I argue in both books, and we can talk about that if it gets there, but I argue it's the most important farm militarily in the Battle of Gettysburg because of the way George Meade and Henry Hunt, the artillery chief, used it. So it was right there ready to be used, and it was.
Now, a key part of your book is focusing on how hospitals were set up at the farm. At what point, as the armies were converging on Gettysburg, did the medical departments in the different corps and divisions start to identify the Spangler Farm as an ideal place for hospitals?
I think the Spangler Farm was the third choice for the 11th Corps because the other 2 choices, one was probably out by the Alms House, which has turned out to be a part of the battle. And I don't know where the second one was. Spangler was well enough behind the line and in safety so that on July 1st, somebody like medical director Jonathan Lutterman, a surgeon Daniel Britton, surgeon Henry Van Arnhem, they would have been on Cemetery Hill, and they probably went out and explored, and they found this farm, and they saw it was perfect. They rode up the Spangler's Lane, told them, you got to get out. We need all of this farm for 11th Corps Hospital. This is a big hospital. Spanglers, I don't know. They argued with them, maybe. But anyway, whatever happened, they talked the surgeons into allowing all 6 of them to stay. Did they want to look after their farm, try to protect it, try to save it? They weren't able to, but they all 6 of them stayed together in one upstairs bedroom of a 2-bedroom house. So that's where they were during the 5 weeks and 2 days that their farm was occupied by the 11th Corps Hospital.
Take us to once the hospital is set up. Were they using the barns and other buildings? Did they set up tents? What would it have looked like?
Well, there were some other outbuildings and sheds on the farm that they used. They ended up putting 4 officers of colonel rank and above in the house. They put Confederate Brigadier General Armistead in the summer kitchen, and they put Harriet Beecher Stowe's son, Fred Stowe, in the summer kitchen. This is an outbuilding. Spanglers didn't have a kitchen for cooking in their house. They used the summer kitchen. So the four highest ranked Union men got the house. So there and there were the doctors and all six Spanglers. And then because they respected Armistead and Stowe, they got the summer kitchen. Everybody else was either in the barn. One estimate was 400 men in the barn, shoulder to shoulder. Another estimate was 500 men in the barn. And they're passing around diseases in there because they're shoulder to shoulder and they're way too close. Like I said, there were other sheds that would have been used, but the tents didn't arrive till after the battle. So like when the thunderstorms hit on July 4th, these men it's just downpours on them in the mud. They're lying in puddles. It's not safe for them. Finally, in about July 5th, some tents begin to arrive, and one worker said they weren't half enough. But within a couple days after that, they were pretty much set up on tents, and everybody was protected in some regard.
What were the sanitary conditions like at the hospital?
Sanitary conditions were horrible, as you might imagine. They probably had just got the Spanglers' horses, dairy cattle, beef cattle, hogs, chickens out of the stable. I don't know how much time they had to clean it up, the barnyard, everything that those animals had left behind, because by 3 or 4 o'clock on July 1st, they were rushing men into that stable. So it would have been terrible.
What would
Yeah.
some of these places where the tents or the barns, what would they have smelled like as a result of the wounds?
Oh,
You mentioned at one point that they were putting pine sprigs in some of these spaces to try to freshen it up.
the problem if you got an amputation or a surgery in the Civil War, especially in amputation, is you got an infection. If you got an infection, the worst of them could be smelled 8 to 10 feet away. So imagine a hospital worker, a nurse walking into a tent with 8 men in there and they all have infections. And so it must have been so bad that it caused them to cut down pine branches out there and hang them on the tents, use them on the ground as bedding, that's kind of a natural air freshener. But as bad as it was for the hospital workers and the nurses and the doctors trying to work under these conditions, and the smells of the organs, that are coming through the skin. Imagine what it was like for these patients in these tents, and they're trying to recover and survive under those smells. It's difficult to imagine today how bad it was.
Now, you mentioned the amputations, and one of the figures you write about is First Sergeant Francis Strickland, and you said that he
Mhm.
woke up while the chloroform wore off while he was having an arm amputated.
Francis Strickland was of the 154th New York, and he was at the Brickyard on July 1st, and he was hitting his arm about his elbow, and they took him to a church in downtown Gettysburg. And about on the 3rd, they took him to a school next to the church, and there they did his amputation. What's important to remember is this is behind the Confederate lines on July 3rd, because the Confederates own the town. And so supplies can't get in. And so they're cutting off his arm and he wakes up. And the surgeon said, he's a grizzly dog. I guess he can stand it. So they just kept going. They just kept cutting away. Afterwards, Strickland said the cutting of the bone wasn't so bad. It was the sewing up of the nerves and the skin that caused him the most pain. But Strickland is a good example of many things from what these soldiers went through. They never identified what, but he contracted a lung disease in 1862. He was still sick with this lung disease. He couldn't breathe. He had to ride to Gettysburg in an ambulance, yet he found a way to get out there and fight, coughing all the time, foul coughing, the reports say. He survived it. He survived his amputation. He went home to New York, but this lung disease, whatever it was, he died from it by his 49 years old, I think. That's what these soldiers were going through. Most of these soldiers were not even well when they got to Gettysburg. And then when they're wounded on top of that, they're not in a good shape to survive short term or long term.
Well, these wounded soldiers had to be transported from where they were wounded on the front lines to the hospital. How were the ambulance corps organized for the battle?
Sure. Well, the Union had they had a much better ambulance corps thanks to Jonathan Letterman, the medical director, who came in 1862. If you were a Confederate soldier, you were just as likely to be picked up by a stolen grocery wagon, a meat wagon, anything, but nothing with any springs on it. The Union designed specific special ambulances for this. Um, they picked the 8 to 10 best men with the most intelligence and bravery. They taught them how to pick up a wounded soldier on a stretcher. They taught them how to walk with him, and they taught them how to put him on the ambulance without being further wounded. Then once he's on the ambulance and the ambulance takes off, they have springs or shock absorbers on these ambulances on the front and back. So they're not bouncing, and these soldiers aren't screaming and crying in agony from being bounced around like the Confederates were. If there was any screaming and crying, it was just their wounds in general. They had water, they had food, they had first aid on these ambulances, and these Union ambulances were so nice that they actually had a canvas cover at the top of it, and it could be brought down surrounding the ambulance at night, and the ambulance workers had sort of a tent to protect themselves from the rain.
So when the battle was ongoing, were they positioned close to where the front line would have been, just waiting for wounded to be brought to them?
The stretcher bearers would have been right up behind the line, hopefully out of fire, but not necessarily so, because it was their job to go in. They had to be close to the line, so they had to go in and get these guys. Now the ambulances, they didn't want them to be destroyed, so they were farther back out of shell range. So the stretcher bearers would go in, pick them up, and then carry them farther behind the line. The 11th Corps had 100 ambulances. The 11th Corps being the hospital that was at George and Elizabeth Spangler's farm. 100 ambulances, not one was damaged during the Battle of Gettysburg. The Second Corps, which had a division hospital on George and Elizabeth Spangler's farm at Granite Schoolhouse, it had 2 of its 100 ambulances damaged. So I don't know if the other armies tried not to shoot at them, or each army were careful about keeping their ambulances out of range.
Now, you mentioned the First Division from the Second Corps. They were at the Granite Schoolhouse.
Yes.
Talk about the conditions there.
Conditions there, the 11th Corps Hospital, they put most of their soldiers into structures: the house, the summer kitchen, the barn, the sheds, until there just got to be too many. The Granite Schoolhouse Hospital, the school itself was being used by the leaders of the Second Corps medical staff, those office headquarters. So they used a field for their hospital next to the school. This was an open field with a few trees on each side. So if a soldier was wounded, this was the hospital for the wheat field, for Rosewoods, for Stony Hill, the Irish Brigade. This was the Irish Brigade's hospital. So if somebody was wounded at the wheat field and they could get him back to Granite Schoolhouse on one of these ambulances, he would be placed in the open. The tents were short because Meade and Hancock had ordered all medical supplies be sent several miles down the road to Maryland to keep the roads clean for troop movement. So there's no clothing, there's no tents, there's nothing for these guys. If they're out in the open in the sun, they need a leg amputation. So they have these tables set up, and I'm assuming there are no photos, but I'm assuming they have canvas covers that they can at least do the amputation underneath the canvas cover. And what they do with them after that, I don't know. Do they put them in the woods for a little bit of coverage? Do they put them back in the open fields? It was bad. It was really, really bad. And no buildings. And then the night of July 2nd, the Confederate artillery on Seminary Ridge and along the Emmitsburg Road start firing over. And these shots are landing way behind the line and they're hitting this hospital. So now they're out in the open and they're getting hit. They managed to make it through the night, but then it happened again on July 3rd prior to Pickett's charge, and they had to pack up the hospital, only leaving behind a few men who couldn't be moved. They were in such condition. So it was and this hospital, when I was researching my two books, I found no more than 2 or 3 paragraphs about it anywhere. But there was a chaplain, Chaplain Stuckenberg, who's buried in Soldiers National Cemetery. He wrote a diary and he offered me a lot of information, and he had names. And starting with him and going through regimental books of regiments that were there, I was able to come up with 3 chapters between the 2 books. And I'm giving a talk in Gettysburg next month. And I'm debuting a talk on the Granite Schoolhouse that I'm excited about because it was an important hospital. And up to 800 men were treated in these fields, in these conditions, these horrible conditions out in the fields.
Who were some of the surgeons who worked at these hospitals, and what were their experiences like?
Sure. One of the main one interesting one at the 11th Corps Hospital, which is again around the Spangler's house and buildings. The 1st Division 2nd Corps Hospital is in the middle of the farm, about a quarter of a mile away. Surgeon Rex Hovey at 136th in New York, he had his wife and 17-year-old son there. They are the only surgeon's family we know of that traveled around to all these battles and hospitals together. She worked as a nurse, Mrs. Hovey. Mrs. Hovey held the soldiers' hands as they were dying. She prayed with them. She tried to ask them about their lives, to take their attention off what they were going through. If they didn't feel like talking, she talked about her life. Unimaginable what her caring. And then after the soldier died, she would write a letter home to the families and let them know. Their 17-year-old son, Frank, he had issues, mental health issues later in life. And, it was in and out of hospitals. It could have been related to his Civil War experiences. But the Spanglers were there the entire 5 weeks and 2 days that the hospital was at Spangler. And then they went home to New York for 3 weeks to recover. And that's also a common refrain. How sick these soldiers, the exhaustion, the illnesses they had after working at Spangler. Dr. Henry Van Arnhem of the 154th New York was very important to me and very important to history because of the letters he wrote to his wife explaining the things he was going to there and the things he saw. But he developed chronic diarrhea in 1862 from the conditions in these camps and these hospitals. If he ate the wrong thing, it brought it on. If he drank the wrong thing, it brought it on. If he sat in a wagon going to the next battle, it brought it on. And so he had to be extra careful while he's saving lives. And he is sick. And then he actually got out of the Army the next year in 64, and he was disabled and handicapped and required 24-hour care later in his life because that chronic diarrhea that he developed in the Civil War stayed with him his whole life. Another guy, Henry Neff from the 153rd Pennsylvania, had pneumonia at Spangler, but he kept working. One guy at the Granite Schoolhouse Hospital, 33-year-old man, died of typhoid fever that fall. This is what the conditions, and Van Arnhem talked about the skins of the animals and how the men wouldn't go to the bathroom where they were supposed to go, and they went whenever. So all of these, the bad water, the blood in the water, the human fluids in the water and in the streams, it all contributed to this. One father came to see his dying son at Spangler. He developed diarrhea there. I'd love to go back and see this hospital, but I don't know if I'm up for it, for the horror of it all.
Now, one of the geographic features at the Spangler property was Powers Hill. And you talk about that as being one of the more strategic hills in the area, among things like Little Round Top and Culp's Hill. Why was this so important?
I believe that Powers Hill was one of the four most important hills in the Battle of Gettysburg, excuse me. Round Top, Cemetery Hill, the two hills that are known today as Culp's Hill and Powers Hill. On the morning of July 3rd, 4:30 a.m., there were 14 cannon up on the hill, and they opened the ball that morning. They opened July 3rd. They were trying to drive the Confederates back on Culp's Hill, which is basically just across the Baltimore Pike from Powers Hill. And they did help drive them back because the Confederates wanted to take Cemetery Hill. They wanted to get the Baltimore Pike was the rear of the line. They wanted to seize the rear of the line. They wanted to get to the ammunition train for the artillery on George Spangler's farm. There was all sorts of damage they can do. And the Union couldn't let them do that. And the first line of defense were those 14 cannons on Powers Hill, most of which George Spangler owned. He owned 3/4 of that hill. And then the artillery was lined all the way up from Powers Hill to modern day Henry Hunt Avenue. And then there were more artillery on Cemetery Hill and East Cemetery Hill that got involved as well. There was infantry on Powers Hill. There was a signal station on Powers Hill. General Slocum's right wing headquarters was on Powers Hill. And the signal station on Powers Hill, there were 6 signal stations in the battle altogether, say at Little Round Top, Culp's Hill, Cemetery Hill, etc., Meade's headquarters. The signal station on Powers Hill was the only one that could see every other signal station. So signals had to be sent through them to most of the other stations that were unseen. You know, I debated even doing a chapter on Powers Hill. It was the last chapter I wrote. But once I gathered all my military facts and the role that the Spangler Farm played in it, it's become one of my favorite chapters. There is one problem, if I could mention it, is the hill today. It's not, the National Park Service hands out these nice maps and it has auto tour on them. And it shows you important places on the battlefield. Powers Hill is not on the Park Service map. So if I'm new to Gettysburg, but I've heard about Powers Hill and I want to find it and explore it, well, I've got to find somebody who will point me in that direction. So this person gets there. Benner's Hill has a sign. That's not as important of a hill. If you find Powers Hill, there's no sign telling you that you found Powers Hill. Okay, you think you found it. There's a little 3 or 4 car dirt parking lot across the street from the hill. Okay, you can park in there, and there's one path up the hill. If you go in the wrong direction, you won't find that one little path because there's no directions. All right, you go back and you find the path. You want to go up and see the monuments and the cannon and all the fun stuff at the top. You've got to climb over 2 or 3 or 4 feet rock walls. There's 2 of them. And, people with certain disabilities, people of a certain age, like myself, you're going to struggle on those walls. So, and then there's one other thing on the top of the hill, behind the top of the hill, there's trash all over the place. So this hill needs a lot of attention. The hill isn't getting the attention and the respect it deserves. So I'm glad I did that chapter because this is how I found all this. And I'm just hopeful that I feel really bad for the Park Service because they're going through some bad things right now. But maybe someday we can get that on their to-do list and give Powers Hill the respect and the due it deserves. And it wouldn't take much time and very little money. So that's my big hope for Powers Hill.
So the last big day of fighting at Gettysburg was July 3rd. After that, what happens to this hospital?
It got busier. Well, the Granite School Hospital, 1st Division of the 2nd Corps, those guys, July 3rd, with the Confederate artillery overshots from Three Pickett's charge coming in, they moved farther behind the line to safety. The 11th Corps Hospital, which is 3 divisions, 1,900 men, July 4th and 5th were the busiest days. They stayed right there. Because once the Confederates retreated, all of the prisoners, the wounded prisoners behind the line were now free to go get hospital care. So those 100 ambulances scoured Gettysburg and brought these guys in. They brought in Barlow, they brought in many, many guys. And so July 4th and 5th were the 2 busiest, most crowded days on this farm, in this hospital, with about 1,900 wounded, 18 to 1,900 wounded there. Soon after, anybody who was able, once they got the railroad going on July 7th, and they could get guys to the railroad station and get them out of town. Any guys well enough to make that ride were sent to hospitals like in Baltimore, DC, York, Annapolis, Chambersburg, places like Harrisburg, places like that. The hospital remained open till August 6th. So again, that's 5 weeks and 2 days. Many surgeons stayed. I would think each day the count went down. And then all of these dirty barn hospitals with the flies and the snakes and whatever out there, these men were all taken to Camp Letterman. And some were taken to what I said were brick and mortar hospitals in those other towns too. So by August 7th, the Spanglers had their farm back, and then they had to begin the rebuilding process.
Well, Ronald Kirkwood is the author of Tell Mother Not to Worry, Soldier Stories from Gettysburg's George Spangler Farm. Ron, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Listeners like you make PCN programming possible. Full episodes of PCN's history and culture content, like the interview you just heard, are available to stream with the PCN Select app. Explore other documentary programs, event coverage, and a lot more. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.